Hello everybody, welcome to our July Training Tuesday event for OU Campus. Today's topic is tag management and XSL. We'll be talking about the tools you can use to start displaying tags on your live website and interacting with them using XSL. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode as the session is being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, you may submit it online by clicking the Q&A tab located on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your question into the dialog box at the bottom of the screen and send. Please direct all questions to the panelists. The presenter will attempt to address your questions during the presentation. After the formal presentation has ended, he will review and answer all remaining questions. Your presenter for today is Brandon Scheirman, Instructional Designer at OmniUpdate, and I will hand it over to him. Brandon?
All right, thanks, Erica. Welcome once again to another exciting Training Tuesday session here. Happy July, and my little holiday-a-day calendar tells me it's National Coffee Milkshake Day, so I hope you enjoy one of those this afternoon after work, perhaps. So, like Erica said, we're going to be talking about tag management and XSL today. It's some pretty exciting stuff. We're going to be essentially breaking some new ground, essentially, during today's Training Tuesday. So I hope that you guys are as excited as I am. So let's go ahead. We'll start off with some PowerPoints, and then we'll go into a live demo after that. Let me just get my stuff here situated. Bum, bum, bum. Alrighty. So, there we go. All right. So today's agenda, we're just going to do a really quick review at the beginning of tag management in the first place, just so we can all make sure we're on the same page. And then I'm going to be talking about taking all of the things that we probably are a little familiar with tag management in terms of, setting tags, managing them within the system. And then we're going to take it a step further by starting to talk about the XSL API for tag management, which is how we're able to pull some of this tags data and display it on a live website and start being able to use it in some more advanced applications. So we'll talk about how it works and also discuss some options of what we can do with it. And then, of course, we'll do a live demonstration and have Q&A. So just to quickly review, tag management is a feature inside OU Campus so that you can essentially have any piece of content that's on your staging server be tagged, and those tags can be used to then organize that content. You can also find related content easily. So if you're searching for, if you're searching through your images directory and you've tagged everything appropriately, you can then search for things that are specifically like images of campus, and then, you just return all of your images that had the campus tag on them or something like that. So essentially it's used within OU Campus to create a more holistic taxonomy and building better associations with images and documents and pages and things of that nature. From an administrator's perspective, administrators can manage tags centrally through the setup menu in the site, and they can also use tag access settings at the site and directory level to manage which tags are available in which portions of the site, and they can also do things like applying fixed tags to directories, so every file within a certain directory will always have, a given list of tags and things like that. So, that's pretty standard. What can we tag? Pretty much everything. Web pages, PDFs, other documents, assets, images, RSS items, all of those things can be tagged inside OU Campus. If it's on the staging server, we can tag it. So let's take that concept one step further. Tags are a great tool when you're working inside OU Campus and finding things and using file choosers and all that sort of stuff. But a common question is, how can we extend that functionality to a published web page so it can start making a difference for the web visitors as well, not just within OU Campus? So the answer to that is the Tag Management XSL API, which we'll be talking about today. And essentially, there are 8 API calls that exist in the system. that you can trigger that are going to pull certain types of information about tags. This tag data is then brought in via XSL. So the way that we call the API is through XSL, and once it's in there, you can use other functions in XSL to then manipulate that data so you can do what you want to do. The way that data is brought in is using the doc function in XPath. That's how we call the API. From a really 10,000 foot view, the doc function essentially allows you to bring in external data from some sort of external source into OU Campus, or into an XSL file. And so essentially, you make your doc call, and then you put the API inside of it, and then it will return data in an XML format. So we'll be looking at this a little bit more, but essentially it's going to bring in your tags as an XML node structure, and then since it's just more XML, you can essentially then do more fancy stuff with it using all sorts of XPath functions to manipulate that data that you're pulling in via the API call. So this is kind of one of the examples of what this would look like from a very simple perspective. So you have a standard XSL copy of, and then inside the select attribute, you're making your document call. So we got that right there. And then everything inside the parentheses is one of the API calls that we have available. So they're always going to start with OU : and then /tag, and then / and then the name of the specific API call that you're going to make. And then potentially you could have some more parameters that are being passed through with the API call at the same time. And then this little / right here, that's just more XPath to say, give me everything starting at this node downwards, and things along those lines. So that's kind of the essential basic format if you want to just kind of work with the basics there. So these are the 8 API calls we have. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of talk about these briefly, but we'll see them kind of in action later on. But essentially, we have the first one is called get all tags. Essentially, if you're calling this function, you're basically just pulling every tag that's in the system, your entire list of tags, and it's going to return basic data. So what the tag name is, whether that tag is disabled, and then if that tag has any children, which would then make it a collection. So that's what get all tags is. Get tags is going to return the tags that have been applied to a specific page or a specific file within the system. And so it's going to return that same tag information, but only for the tags that have been applied to that particular file. Get fixed tags will return any fixed tags that have been applied to a specific directory. Get combined tags will work really similarly to get tags. The main difference is that combined tags will also list any fixed tags that have been applied to that file's parent directory. So if, for example, I have a page on my site that has athletics and admissions as my normal tags, but then I've also applied testing to the directory that that file belongs to. If I ran get combined tags, I would get back all 3 of those tags, if that makes sense. Then we move on to get parents and get children. These two function similarly to one another, and it's essentially just returning more data about the tags themselves, not so much a particular file associated with them. Get parents is going to, you're going to, search for a particular tag, and it's going to tell you if that tag belongs to any collections and which collections it belongs to. So if I put basketball as the parameter that I'm passing to this API call, and basketball is a tag that belongs to the athletics collection, then I would get the athletics collection returned as my parent. And get children essentially is the corollary to that. I can enter in the name of a collection, and it'll tell me the tags that belong to that collection. So if I pass through athletics as my tag that I'm doing through this API call, then I could get the data for basketball, football, baseball, all the other tags that belong to that collection. And these final two API calls, get files with any tags and get files with all tags, instead of returning data about tags, it's returning data about pages or files. So what essentially you can do is you can pass through a list of tags. So, you have a collection of about 4 tags, and you can run this API call, and it will essentially find any files that contain any like one or more of the following tags. So if I searched for, basketball, baseball, football, and I ran get files with any tags and had those 3 tags as my, parameters, then I would return any files that had either baseball, basketball, or football as a tag that had been applied to that file. And get files with all tags function similarly. It would then return data for pages that contain all of those tags. So, in the previous example, if I had one of those files like the athletics index page or something like that, that had, baseball, basketball, and football applied to it, from the tags view and page properties, then that would be the only file that I would get back. So essentially that's kind of the basics. If, you can't remember all the things that I just walked through, luckily we have some documentation on the support site that you can always reference back instead of having to just listen to me or try to remember everything that I just said there. So just a little bit more information about those API calls. Each one of them requires different parameters to be passed to it through like a URL query string. So an example is when I'm making the get all tags API call, there's no additional parameters. I just need to say, OU:/tag/get all tags, and that's the call. That's all I need to do. But if I were making the get combine tags call, I would have to put the site name for the file that I'm trying to find, so what site it belongs to, and then also the root relative path to that file, so the API knows what file I'm looking for. So I mean, some of it's a lot of common sense in terms of the parameters that you need, but just kind of keep that in mind. We'll look at the formatting for what those parameters look like and all that sort of stuff when we launch into the live demonstration. And also, like I said, the support site lists all of the parameters, it lists all of the API calls, and also what their basic functions are. So, I always like to make PDF copies of my PowerPoint slides. They're put on the support site and the OCN after Training Tuesdays. Make sure just to download the PDF, and you can go onto this link, and you can also just find this on the support site for the full documentation. Since it's Training Tuesday, I don't want to spend too much time talking about it like this, because I know that it would be easier just to have as a reference that you can refer to at any time. Okay, so some examples of what things we can do with these API calls, and this essentially is a preview of the stuff that, some of the stuff that I'll be doing today. So the first kind of easy example would be you can then have your tags that you've tagged your content with and have those be pulled in as meta keywords for your published page. You could also display all of the tags that have been applied to a certain page or something like that. So a nice little box that says, hey, this page has been tagged with blah, 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 these tags. You could even use something you could use tags in conjunction with perhaps a server-side solution to have like a related content box. So, maybe extending the functionality of the little box that displays the tags for the current page. You could have all those tags be linkable, and then you could then see any files that have also been tagged with those words or key phrases or whatever. But essentially, because we're drawing in this data into XML and XSL, and then you can do whatever you want with it, anything is possible. You can pretty much, anything that you can dream up, I'm sure there's probably at least some sort of way that you can do it inside XSL. It's just limited to, your imagination, basically. So let's go ahead and look at some of these examples, and I'll be showing off some files that we've developed that can make this process a little bit easier. So over here, I have my good old sandbox. Let me just go ahead and log in really quickly. Alrighty. So I'm here inside my site, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is I just want to kind of show you what my tags look like right now. So in the setup menu over in tags, you can see that I have, quite a few tags. I've got 18 of them. I have a couple of collections, which are, groups of tags essentially. I've got one tag that's been disabled because it looks like OU Campus and Omni Update, maybe they're too similar, so I just disabled one of them. So anything that I want to tag just with my company name, I'm just going to always call Omni Update. So I've got that going on there. And if we hop into a couple of my example files, so like in this training section, for example, if I go to tag access for this directory, you can see that I can apply some fixed tags. So perhaps I can just apply the fixed tag of testing, meaning that any file that's within my training section will then automatically have the tag of testing applied to it. So I can just go ahead and do that. And then I can hop inside here and look at, maybe this training page. Check it out, go to properties. You can see the testing there, it's been applied. It's a fixed tag, so I can't remove it. And then I can just go ahead and add a couple more, for example. So we can do Omni Update, we can do academics, and one more. Just because I love basketball so much, we'll tag it with basketball. So, essentially whatever I want to do here, I've added some tags. That's pretty good. Let me just go ahead and do that to one more file here. Okay, looks like I've already added athletics here, but you know what, I'm going to change it to be a different one. Let's just have that one be admissions for right now. So, that's all pretty easy. I'm sure that if you're here on this Training Tuesday, you've probably experimented with tags already in your site. So, all of that stuff is pretty straightforward. What we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and upload some new files that we've developed that are going to enable us to use these tag management functions and features that I just spent a couple minutes in the PowerPoint talking about. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to hop into my _resources folder, into the XSL folder, and I'm going to actually go into _shared. What I'm going to be doing is I have written some files with the help of Rob Kiffey, who's one of he's our senior support specialist, I think is his new title, but he's been a great help with me in helping kind of get all of this sort of stuff developed. So, if you ever email him, give him some props for that because he's been great. But essentially, what we've done is we have developed an XSL file that instead of having to manually make these API calls via the document function, we've tried to make the process a little bit more user-friendly, and I'll kind of show you what I mean here in a second. I'm going to upload this file that we've developed called tagmanagement.xsl, and I'm also going to really briefly bring in, actually, you know what? That's all I need to do for right now. Let's go into this tag management file and we'll kind of see what it is. Let me just increase this so it's a little easier to read. What essentially this file is we have turned every one of these API calls into a function inside XSL. And the reason why we've done this is we want to make the process as easy as possible to be able to call this data across a wide variety of use cases. So if I were to have to manually call these APIs, what I would have to do every time, let me just pull up an example here, is say for example, I want to pull in the combined tags of a certain file. So what I would have to do is, I'm just pasting this content in here just randomly, is I would have to do essentially something like this. I would have to do some sort of copy of, and then I would have to write in my doc call, which is all this, and then I would have to manually pass through these parameters into a URL query string when I'm making the API call. And Ivanka, she just asked if I can share the tag management.xsl file. Yes, absolutely. I was going to mention this later on, but essentially all the files that I'm going to be showing you today that I mentioned that we've developed, I'm going to be zipping them up and putting them on the support site and on the OCN, so you guys can play around with them as well. I hope they are of great use to you guys because they were great use for us, and I hope that you can start playing around with them. So yes, absolutely, you guys will all be able to check out these files that I will be spending most of my time talking about today. So going back to this, if I had to manually make a doc call every time, I would have to, pass through this, make my API call. So here's the specific API call I'm making, and then I would have to pass through these parameters. So the first parameter is I would have to pass through the site name, and so that would have to manually change every time I'm making this call in a different site. So, this one was from the conference, so I'd have to manually rewrite this to be Galena, for example, in my example, because Galena is right there as my site name. And then I would have to pass in the root relative path for whatever file I want to know. So in this case, I would have to encode my slashes for URI, and I would have to, put the root relative path. That's just a lot of work, and it could potentially be dangerous because, if you forget a % sign or something like that, you'll get an error. So essentially what this tag management XSL file has done is we've tried to take all of the guesswork out of writing this manually and make it as easy for you guys as possible, and also as easy for us as possible too, because no one wants to really have to hand type all of this sort of stuff. So let's just kind of scroll down, and I'll kind of walk you through what this file looks like and how it functions, and then we'll start actually applying some things that we're learning from this. As you can see, there's lots of comments that will hopefully detail how to use this. So if you forget what we're talking about now, that's all right. As soon as you download the file, it should be fairly self-explanatory. But essentially, we have each one of the API calls is turned into its own function, and depending on the API call, it will give you different data, and the function might look a little bit differently. So the first function is for get page tags, and what that one is doing is it's making the get tags API call. And it can require 2 parameters or none, or it can require 0 parameters in the function, 1 parameter in the function, or 2 parameters manually entered into the function. If you don't pass through any parameters and you're just calling the OU get page tags function, which essentially would look something like this, XSL copy of select equals OU, oops, forgot my $sign. Or no, I don't need a $sign, it's a function. Get page tags. If I do something like this, not passing any parameters into the function itself, then what it's going to do is it's essentially going to redo the function, but it's going to use this system parameter, which is actually brand new, called OU staging path, and it's also going to just take the current site. This OU staging path was actually just released late last week with the release of version 10.4.2. So if you are a SaaS customer, you have this added into your system, or at least the system knows what it is. If you're an ESL customer, as soon as you upgrade to 10.4.2, you'll be able to have it. And essentially what it does is it just grabs the staging server's path, root relative, to your current file, so whatever file you're currently on. In the past, we only had variables that would allow us to get the production server path. So we've added this because the API needs to know the staging server path location and not the production server location. So it'll just essentially take your current page and run the API for the current page. You could pass through a single parameter, and what that would essentially look like would be something like this. Index.pcf, something like this. So there's my root relative path. I've added that into the function. If that's the case and I'm only passing a single parameter through, then it's essentially going to take that path and then append the current site to it. And then the other way you could do it is you could pass 2 parameters through, and I could do something like this. And so, oops. And so in that case, I forgot my little quotes beforehand, so apologize for that. You still need those. But you know, if I was doing something like this and I'm passing 2 parameters through this function, then it will take whatever path I've specified and whatever site I've specified, and it will add that into, oh, I thought I still had it written there. It will add that into the API call, so you don't have to hand type it and worry about all the correct formatting. So this is way easier than having to remember the entire doc call. I hope we can all agree on that. And that's essentially what we've got going on there. And then we've finally just included a little bit of logic to make sure that if it's returning, if there are no tags, you know, if whatever file that you're querying has no tags applied to it, you don't get some crazy error. It'll just return a blank value. So we've made that also a little bit safer as well. So, you know, all of these things essentially are to make everyone's lives a little bit easier, and many of the functions function this way. Functions, functioning. Anyways, so that's what our first one is, get page tags. You can pass through the site name, your current path, or it'll just automatically take the path for whatever file you're currently on. Get fixed tags will function basically the same. If you pass through no parameters, it will take your current directory in your current site. You can pass through a path manually, and it will append the current site if you're just doing 1 parameter. And if you're doing 2 parameters, once again, a custom site and also a custom path on staging. And then it will essentially just take your, it will take the path, break it down to just be the directory in which that path creates, or, you know, the parent directory of that file, and then executes the get fixed tags API. Get combine tags. The function works exactly the same as the get page tags function. And, you know, essentially what it's just doing is it's just giving you the ability to also grab the fixed tags that have been applied to the directory, as well as the tags that have been manually applied to that specific file. Get all tags, like I said, does not require any parameters. So essentially the way that you would call this function is you would always just do, let's see what I have there. Oh, looks like I still had it pasted. You would essentially just do, you know, copy of select get all tags. Boom, mission accomplished, done. So we've got that going on. It doesn't require any parameters like we've talked about before. Next, we have get children. This requires 1 parameter, and essentially you just have to enter in the name of the tag. So if you are saying, get me the children of athletics, because you know athletics is a collection inside your site, then you would just have to do OU-get children tags, and then you'd pass through the word children as the tag, and it will add it to the query string. Boom, just like that. Same thing for get parent tag. You just have to enter in the tag that you want to find any collections it belongs to, and it will do just the same way as we saw before. And then the final 2 are get files with any tags and get files with all tags. These essentially make slightly different API calls, because instead of returning data about the tags themselves, it's going to return data about pages that satisfy some sort of, you know, some list of tags. And so the output that the API call kind of gets you once you, make the document call and everything, that's going to look a little bit different. The formatting of that's going to look different because it's going to return page data instead of tag data. But we'll look at that in a second. Essentially, you just have to pass through a single parameter, which is a list of tags. So if you want to search all files that contain any of the following tags, athletics, academics, admissions, then I would just put in like a comma-separated value or something inside my function. So I just do something like copy of with any tags, and then I could then just start adding in my comma-separated value. So I could just do something like athletics, if I can spell athletics right, admissions, academics. Something like that. You want to make sure that you're not separating each one of them with its own separate quote, because that means the function then XSL would think that you're passing multiple parameters into the function, which the function doesn't accept. It only accepts one. So just make sure that just your entire list of tags is within one essentially statement, if that makes sense. So then it's going to append that list of tags and encode it properly, because in the API call itself, you actually have to, it's going to take a format like, here, let's see if I can just do this really quickly. You have to be able to pass through a single, the site name. So just like what we did before, the doc call is essentially going to look like this. So you're going to have site equals, whatever your site name is, Galena in this example. And then we would also have to encode amp tag equals, and then you'd have to write your first tag, athletics. And then you'd have to do amp tag equals academics. Amp tag equals admissions, etc. So as we can see, if you're searching through a lot of tags, you're going to have to write that a whole bunch. And so essentially, this function will automatically take your comma-separated value that you're passing through the function. It's going to split it up. It's going to add the ampersand between every tag, and it's going to pass that entire thing into the API call. Once again, making everybody's lives easier. And then the get files with all tags, the function works the exact same. I forgot to mention that you can also pass through a custom site name. So it will essentially return data for a particular site. If you're only passing a single parameter, pass through the tag list, but you can pass through your tag list and then also a site that's not your current site if you wanted to. We've got a quick question from Angela French. She's asking, can links to client sites that have made creative use of the API calls be provided to us to go look at? Potentially, I can follow up with our professional services department. Since this is, since tag management is a fairly new feature in the first place, I'm not quite sure how many customers have taken full advantage of this. Like I said, a lot of this tag management file, we developed essentially this last week. So, there probably aren't too many examples of people using these exact functions, but I know that there's examples of some customers using kind of this tag API information. So I will follow up the professional services department and see if there's some examples that they can show off. It'll just kind of depend on whether, whether they have the permission to show those things off. But what we will be doing is, any of the examples that I talk about today, I'll be providing those inside the same zip file. So at least, at the very, very least, you can see a couple really easy examples that I'll be covering today. And then we can also just, we can just open up a dialogue to figure out, best practices or maybe creative uses moving forward. The OCN, the forum on the OCN is a great place for that. So I'll see what I can do about that, Angela. Good question. So those are all the essential functions. At the bottom of the file, this is just something that's nice to know. It's good to understand what the actual, what data you're actually returning. So essentially, when I'm making an API call for any of the files that return actual tag data, the doc call is going to essentially bring in a file that has this format right here. And if I remove the comments here, just so you don't have to see it in gray, It's going to output a file with the root node of tags, and then each individual tag inside of it is going to have its own tag node, and then there's 3 child nodes inside of it. So the first one is name. It's going to give you the tag name. It's going to have a node called disabled, which will just either give you a true or false value, and that's just to reflect whether the file is whether the tag has been disabled from the setup tags menu. And then finally, there's going to be a node called children, and it's just going to have an integer value. If the value is 0, that means that the tag is not a parent or not a collection of anything. It's just a tag. But if the integer value here is 1 or more, then that means that that tag is a collection and it contains X amount of children inside of it. And if you want to know what those children are, then you can run the API call called get children. So that's the kind of format that you're going to get for every API call aside from these last 2, which is get files with all tags and get files with any tags. So we have a little reminder just to see what that looks like here inside the document. And then if you run the last 2 API calls, get files with any tags or get files with all tags, it's going to output an XML file that has this format. And so the root node is going to be pages this time, and every page that satisfies whatever parameters that you're passing through is going to be listed within a page node. And then it's going to have a child node called path, which is the root relative path to the file on staging. So here's a little quick example. So it'll probably end with PCF or .img or whatever whatever file you're looking for, because obviously you can tag things more than just websites or web pages. And then it'll also give you the last published date. And this is for a couple of reasons. The first reason is you might have tagged a file on staging, but you've not published that file ever before. So you don't want to necessarily accidentally link to that file on the production server or something like that. So you could potentially have some logic that essentially, if the last published date is blank, then don't make a link to it or something like that. But it's just going to give you a date and timestamp for whenever that page was last published. And that's essentially what it is. Each page is going to have its own individual page node with those 2 child nodes within it. So that's what the format is going to look like on that file. So that's essentially what we've got here, our tag management.xsl file, super useful. Really quickly, right up at the top, I do want to mention this little parameter, or this variable that we've called OU staging path. You know how I had mentioned earlier that there was I had mentioned that there is a system variable called OU staging path, functions very similarly to like OU path, if you're familiar with the system variables. Essentially, since this got released last week, it's probably not in many of your OU variables.xsl files. So we've conveniently added it here inside the tag management file. So if you want to start playing around with the API calls, you can just keep it as is. If you're an ESL client and OU staging path doesn't exist for you within the Java backend, what we've done is we've assigned just a default value, which essentially just replaces your HTTP path and then replaces the .html with, or dot whatever, with .pcf. So it's just kind of like a quick, easy way to do like a cheater version of OU staging path, and you can use that to essentially hold you over until you upgrade to 10.4.2, if that makes sense. And then this extra variable called page tag CSV, this will actually come into play with one of the examples that I'm just about to show you here in a second. So essentially, going back to OU staging path, if you wanted to, you could actually take this, everything past the select parameter, and you could just copy and paste that into your OU variables document if you wanted to, because that's where your other system variables live, so it would make sense to keep them together. And for new customers and things like that, that's probably what we'll be rolling out now that this variable exists. But for all of you guys, existing customers, you can just keep it here for now, and then maybe at some point in the future, take that and start moving it into your other file. But anyways, so we've essentially got this. It's a great little file. We've got this going on. What I'm going to do is, now that it's inside my staging server, I'm going to import that file into common.xsl, so any file that I'm actually, that's importing common will give me access to all of those beautiful functions, because if I'm not, if I'm not importing it into common, then it's almost, there's no use for me to have those functions in the first place. So right up here at the top of common.xsl, I'm just going to make another import statement to bring in that file. So just like this. So now anything that imports common is going to give me access to those lovely functions. And now let's talk about some applications for all of these functions that I just spent so much time discussing. So the first example I want to talk about is a very simple one, and it is just adding tags as the meta keywords for my site. Let me really quickly open up one of my just standard interior pages. Let's go into my training page, .pcf. And if I just go to the preview view. If I view the frame source, which essentially gives me just a fake preview for what the page will look like on production, you'll notice that inside my head code, here, let me zoom in on this. This is a little hard to read, I'm sure. If I zoom into the head code here, you'll notice that I do not have any sort of meta tag that has keywords in it. But maybe I want to start adding it. The way that we used to do that is we used to make a page property, and you'd have to have those page properties, manually add them, and then use XSL to bring those page properties in. That's one way to do it. But now, since we have these tags, why don't I just have the tags that I've tagged it automatically become my meta keywords? So going back to common, downside is that I'm going to have to rezoom. All right, so I'm here in common, and I'm in the head code, and you'll notice that here's my title. We have this little safeguard here in case there's any other sort of metadata that's being added to my pages. And what I can do right underneath is I can do add a meta tag called meta keyword, or meta name equals keywords. And then my content. And typically in a normal HTML file, I just start adding in my keywords, just like this, blah, etc. And I can have that be done right here. But instead of hard coding anything, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of one of my API calls to bring that data in. So let me really briefly go back to my tag management.xsl file, just so we can very easily understand what's going on here. What I'm going to be using is I'm going to take advantage of this variable name called page tags CSV, which essentially is grabbing all of the current the page tags for the current page that I'm on and putting it into a nice little comma-separated value. So what it's doing is it's taking advantage of string join, which I believe is an XSL T3.0 function. So if you only have XSL 2.0 or 1.0 or something like that, this function may not work. You might have to use something like concat instead. But since we use XSL 3.0 in our sandbox, and most people I feel like do at this point, we're using that. And so it's executing the function get combine tags. And as a reminder, get combine tags will give me all of the tags for that particular file. And then I'm passing through OU staging path, which is the current current location of my file on staging, and then the current site of whatever I'm in. And then it's going down to every tag and just grabbing the name of every tag and comma separating those names. So it's going to give me a comma separated list of all of the files or all of the tags that have been added to my file. So I've got this. What I'm going to be doing is inside of common, I'm going to use curly brackets, which is essentially kind of the shortcut way of grabbing a value of something when it's already inside of quotes. So for example, I wouldn't be able to write another XSL node in here, so I couldn't do something like XSL value of, because then as soon as I finish writing out select correctly, which apparently is a struggle for me, as soon as I add another quotes, it causes problems. So what you do in that situation is you've got your curly brackets right here. So I'm going to grab the value of that variable. And if I just go back here and remind myself, this is the name of my variable. So I can do this. And then I just do our universal variable symbol of $sign. So what I'm doing is I'm going to just grab the value of whatever the comma-separated value of my page tags are and have that be my keywords. So I'm going to quickly save my XSL. I'm going to go back to my training page. Just as a reminder, looks like the page is reloading. We'll wait a second. I'm here in page properties. Here's a reminder. These are the 4 tags that have been applied to my page: academics, baseball, OmniUpdate, or academics, basketball, OmniUpdate, and testing. Now, if we go back to the preview, now that my common.xsl has been saved, this should be reflecting now in my page preview. And if I just go into view frame source again, and if I zoom in here, right underneath title, we now have a meta tag with the name of keywords, and then the content, and there are my tags right there. Easily done, and if I wanted that to appear on my production server, all I would need to do is publish my page. So very set it and forget it, and as soon as this list gets updated, it would dynamically be updated as well on my production server as we go through the process of publishing things and all that. So fairly simple situation. I know that some of you, I know my sandbox doesn't have keywords added as a page property. If I go back here, I don't have another field here called keywords. I know that some customers do. So in a situation like that, what you could do is, I'm actually just going to copy and paste this time, is instead of just grabbing the variable here, because potentially you might already have a meta tag in common.xsl, what I could do instead is I could do this, which is still going to grab the value of, but what it's going to do is it's first going to grab any sort of tags that have been added to a parameter, OUC properties, label equals metadata, and it's going to grab anything that's already, added as a keyword field inside of your system, and then it's just going to append any tags to the end of that. So you've got that going on as well, which is pretty great. It's basically just a nice little fail-safe, so you don't have to undo all of the hard work that you had spent X amount of months or years doing beforehand. So that's kind of the first solution. Let me just quickly save this, and I'm just going to reload my page source so you can see that it doesn't remove the tags that I had already, but if I had more keywords, then it would add them before here. So it looks like, in this example, you would only want to do it if you actually have keywords added to your pages, because it gives you that first comma there. So hypothetically, we could potentially refine that function a little bit just to make sure that if there's no other tags, we could remove that little comma there. But, essentially, that's what we've got going on here. The other quick little thing I wanted to show you as a neat example is maybe, listing them as keywords is great, but we wanted to also kind of display them actually visually on our published page. So what we could do is I could make a little box that just shows me the page tags that have been made on my current page. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hop back into Common. I'm actually just going to go back to my previous way of adding keywords here. Copy and paste, there we go. I'm going to exit out of common.xsl, and I'm going to go into my interior pages. And in my interior page, I can just scroll down here. Looks like over here I've got, these are some pieces of content that are being added to my left-hand column. So if I go on this, I've got a 2-column layout. My left column is right over here. If I wanted to add a little box, maybe underneath my navigation that says, you know, what tags have been applied to the page, this is what I could do. I could make a little thing that, you know, just a little comment, page tags, do that, and then I am just going to copy and paste some stuff from my text editor that I've got, format that correctly here. So essentially I'm just going to have a nice little div, and I'm actually going to give a class to this. Div class equals quick links. Oh, you know what? I just realized that all of this is in the main content region. Let's get this out of here. Oh, you know what? No, I'm right. Sorry. Got a little bit confused there. Essentially, it's just going to make a little box there. It's going to call it tags, and it's going to say, hey, this page has been tagged with. And then I'm going to call this template called page tags. And so let's just scroll down to kind of the bottom here once I'm getting out of my structure. And I'll just make another line here. And I'm going to paste this, what I've got going on right here. And this is my template. It's called page tags, so it's just going to essentially grab this data. And there's a little bit of a logic test that we've got going on here. It's just saying when, there we go, my function of get page tags, when that is greater than 0. So when there are tags that have been applied to my page, I'm going to make a little bulleted list, and each one of those tags I'm going to just grab the name of it. And otherwise, if there are no tags, then it'll have a little message that says, hey, this page has not been tagged. What I could potentially do is, actually, I'll just show you this. So we'll do get page tags first. I'm going to save interior.xsl, hop over to my training page, and if I just click preview again, it should give me my nice little box. So, you know, fairly easy, just kind of listing them out here. And as you can see, I have only 3 tags applied instead of the 4 that we saw before when I was grabbing metadata. And the reason for that is because I am using the get page tags API call as opposed to the get combine tags API call. So what I could do instead of get page tags, I could just do get combine tags. Replace that here too. Combine tags. The functions work the same, so I don't need to worry about passing any parameters here. I'll save again. And then as soon as I reload, I now should have my fixed tag called testing added right there. You know, if I wanted to play around with it again, I could just do fixed tags instead of that. And it should get me testing exclusively. Boop. And there we go. And now I have testing. So, you know, as you can see, these functions work pretty similarly. They're fairly interchangeable. At least those 3 are. And instead of having to rewrite a whole bunch of crazy stuff, we just were able to do that really nice and easily. I think as a best practice, get combined tags is probably the one that we want to use when we're listing out all of the tags that have been added to a page. So we got that going on right there. And that's pretty much done right there. So those are kind of like 2 really easy examples of ways to use the tag management API calls. obviously with the help of the functions that we've developed. But, if you really wanted to, instead of having to, do this function, you could still write out the doc call. It is not mandatory by any means. It'll make things a little bit more difficult, yes, perhaps, maybe a little bit less flexible, but if you wanted to hand type the document calls, you could do that the same way. So that's kind of what we got going on there. Now, before we kind of wrap up with a final Q&A, I do have a couple extra cool tools that we've made that might be of use to you guys. Let me hop back into just right here. I can close out my tag management file here. Go back to interior.xsl. So in addition to the tag management XSL file that I've just been kind of showing you, we've also developed essentially kind of like a basic playground file that allow you to play around with all of the API calls. And in order to get it to work, we also have this other XSL file called tagtesting.xsl. Since it's a little bit less important to kind of see what exactly this is doing, it doesn't have any additional functions in here. It's just a nice little kind of, it's what enables this playground file to work. We have this, and essentially what it's going to do is it's just going to have a little explanation of every single one of the API calls, and it will allow you to play around with different values of the parameters for all of these API calls. And so we've just got, a bunch of things in here to just make all of that work. So we have this tagtesting.xsl, and in conjunction with that, we have a file called tagdemo.pcf that would then be linked to that file. So let me just put that in my training section for now. You'll get both the PCF and the XSL file in the zip file that we'll be talking about, so you'll be able to play around with this as much as you want, but I just want to really briefly show it to you. So we've got tagdemo.pcf. And if I go into the source code, essentially all this file is a root node called document, and then a bunch of different page properties. Everything else is being done in the XSL. And these page properties allow you to play around with the different APIs and add different values to the API calls. So if we go into page properties really quickly, we can see kind of an example of that. So we've got little headings that show what API calls correspond to these parameters. And essentially I could just, make little adjustments here to pass different parameters through. But just so you can see what this file looks like, first of all, I want to make sure that we are changing our PCF style sheet path to make sure that it points to the new location. So just make sure that wherever you've uploaded your tag testing file, if you're playing around with this later, that you make sure that the PCF style sheet is pointing to it. As we can see here, I'm in my XSL folder. There's tag testing. So this one's ready to go. Let's go to the page preview here. And it's just really basic. So here's my little thing. Here's the API call. Here's a description of what it is. In this case, it's get all tags. And essentially, it's just giving me a list of all the tags that have been added to my system. So what we've done here is we've just kind of added a little bit of formatting to make it easy to read. So this obviously isn't returning the exact node structure of the file that the doc call is actually pulling in. But if you wanted to, you could potentially, alter that tag testing XSL file to output the XML if you want to see just the raw XML output. So we've got get tags and get combined tags. As we can see here, we're not passing any additional parameters through here. So what it's doing is it's just adding the default values for, the current page or the current directory, which is why we're getting some data already for get fixed tags and for the get combined tags. But in here, for example, get parents, if I want to see the parents of a certain file, I can just go to page properties, click on get parents, enter in a tag name. I've used the example of basketball a couple times before. I can hit save, and as soon as that's done, I can now go to Get Parents, and it looks like basketball has a parent, which means it's part of a collection, and that collection name is Athletics, and it has 4 children, for example. And then I could just go in and say, okay, tell me more about athletics. I'll go to the Get Children API call. I'll add the collection name. I'll say athletics right here. And then I scroll down to Get Children, and boom, there are the 4 tags that belong to the athletics collection. And vice versa, I could do stuff with the Get Files with Any tags, the Get Files with All tags calls. So essentially what you can do is you can just play around with these page properties, look for different files and all that sort of stuff, and it will just dynamically return you data, so you could just kind of have this be your personal little playground. So this tag demo PCF is a lot of fun to kind of mess around with and just get a little bit more familiar with, what things are going to give you what kinds of data. So we've got that going on as well. So that essentially wraps up all that I wanted to show you today. I mentioned that we have further documentation for all of these API calls on our support site. I'll just really quickly show you where that is. If we go to the support site, it's actually going to be right underneath Recent Features, XSL API for tag management. You can click on that right there, and it's going to take you to a nice little description. Basically, it's going to cover everything that we talked about today, and even with potentially more detail. So it'll tell you the raw output for the document calls. It'll tell you the example of what one of those doc calls look like. It's going to tell you all of the API calls. I can look at Get Combined tags. You'll see an example of the pure doc call and what the output is. We had decided to essentially just show you what it would look like if you were making the doc call itself, as opposed to using our functions, because I wanted to make sure that, we're not going to force you to use these functions if you don't want to, essentially. So this is a treasure trove of information. You can check all that stuff out at your leisure. And at the end of this Training Tuesday, I will probably upload the sample files that I mentioned. Not only will they be on the OCN, and they'll probably also be on the Training Tuesdays page on our support site, but I'll probably also add a download link here on this page as well. So if you're on this page and reading more about the API calls, you can also download the example files and play around with those as well. Looks like we have a couple questions here, so that's great. We've got a question from Danielle, and she's asking, can we delete all tags on an account at once? Some tags have been used incorrectly as meta tags. To my knowledge, I don't believe that you could delete all tags on an account fully at once, but the best way to try to do that would be to go into site settings. So if you go to set up sites, and if you went to your entire site and went down to tag access, for example, you might be able to do some overriding here from the site, the tag access settings. You could apply all selected settings to existing files and folders. You could overwrite existing tags, and then you could just write fixed tags and have none there. That could potentially wipe out all of the tags if you wanted to. I haven't actually tried that myself, so I'm not quite sure if it'll totally work or if it just won't add any other fixed tags. If you leave this field blank, I'm not sure if it'll completely wipe it all out, but that would be what I would try. And then we also have another question from Danielle, kind of a follow-up. She's asking, can we lock all tags to level 10 administrators? Oh, darn. At the top of my head, I do not remember, but I will make sure that I'll follow up with our development team to determine what users are able to create what tags. I believe there might be a site setting for it, but for right now I'm drawing a blank. I apologize for that, but I will make sure, Danielle, to email you the answer about if you can lock adding tags on specific files. What you can do that I know is sort of similar to that is you can have filtered tags which essentially allows administrators to enforce only a certain list of tags that anyone can add. So, by default, people can add whatever they want as any tag anywhere. But what you can do is, say, for example, I only have an approved list of tags that I want people to tag content with. I could make that be a collection inside of setup tags, and then I could add it as a filtered tag to the entire site so people can only choose from those tags, for example. So if I was in the athletics directory and I only wanted people to choose from athletics-related tags for the files within that directory, I could choose the athletics tags as filtered tags, and then people would only be able to choose from the content within there, as opposed to whatever the heck they wanted. So I know that that's an easy, or not an easy solution, but that gets you close to what you're asking for, but I'll make sure to follow up with the development team there. We've got another question here from Patty Bradley. She's asking, if the XML returned by the getFiles functions only includes paths, how can we create links to the files it returns? Patty, I think that is a great question. My best solution off the cuff right now you'd probably have to do some sort of replace function with XPath to then it's gonna give you the staging path, and you could essentially just say for every path node, replace the .pcf with .html or .php or whatever in order to create hyperlinks. So you could essentially just grab that, maybe store that data as a variable and then just kind of manipulate the content of that variable inside of an A tag to make hyperlinks. So that would be kind of like the way that I would probably assume it could be done, but it might, it might depend on a lot of different factors. So if you have specific questions about that, it might be worth reaching out to either support at Omni Update or just reaching out directly to the team that implemented your site, and they might be able to think of some creative solutions for you. But I would say, the first way is just to kind of try stuff out. Luckily, if you're using our functions, hopefully they're safe enough to the point where you won't need to worry about creating red bombs or a bunch of crazy errors. So you could also potentially manipulate it with some server-side code as well, just essentially pull in the raw XML data using XSL and then have PHP sitting on your production server that does more manipulation from that on out. I think there's a lot of different ways that you could potentially do it, but those are the two ways that I could think of off the top of my head there. But I always like to add the disclaimer, I'm only partially a developer. I think that, as much as I like to learn, and I feel like I've picked up quite a bit over the last year or so, there are many other people at Omni Update who are far more knowledgeable than I on those subjects, so they may be able to answer that question in greater detail for you. But great question. That's definitely a good thing to think about. Alrighty. So with that, looks like never mind. I was just about to wrap up. We got another question from Nick. So Nick is wondering, what's the best way to keep some tags private, fixed tags or disabled tags? Which is best at keeping us from displaying tags like testing or development on the public site for related tags? Yeah, that's a good question, Nick. It would depend on kind of the way that you have tagged things, because both ways would work, but each kind of have their own strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, a disabled tag, if you have disabled a tag, that means that it can no longer be added to any more files in the system as long as it's disabled. But it won't be automatically removed from a file that it's already been added to. So in an example, if I went to like my training page or something like that and added, testing as like a disabled or as a normal tag to this file. Actually, that's a bad example because testing is already one that I added. But say, for example, I go in here and I just write test and have that be a tag. I would go here, it would display here, etc. Then I could potentially go into setup tags and disable it, and that just means that I couldn't add test to any other files. but it would still remain tagged here. What you could do is in my little text box or my little related tags box, I could add some logic that says if the tag, if there's any tags that have the value of the disabled node equal to true, so if something's disabled, you could exclude that from the list, and maybe that's one way to do it. But then if you want to label something as testing or development later on, well then, you're stuck because you've already disabled it. You'd have to re-enable it, tag it as testing or development, and then re-disable it, and then maybe in the meantime you're having those things be displayed. So that's potentially one way to do it. You could use fixed tags as well, and then just call the get tags function as opposed to the get combine tags function. But then the downside for that is that maybe you have something that's a fixed tag that you do want displayed. Well, there's no way to really determine, there's no real way to differentiate if it's like this one particular fixed tag. So I guess what it boils down to is you probably have to determine on a case-by-case basis whichever way works for you. You could do it either way. My best guess would probably be making it disabled, because I would assume that if you have something labeled as testing or development, but now it's getting to the point where you have it on the public site, maybe you're not tagging things as testing or development anymore. So disabled tags might be the way to go, but it may just kind of depend. So with that in mind, that's pretty much what I've got for you today. But the last thing I do want to just remind you all, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is fairly new. Tag management just came out like a month or so ago. All of these new features we've pretty much spent all last week developing. The OU staging path just got added like 3 business days ago. So all of this is still fairly new, not only just to you guys, but also to us here within the company. So as things keep going and we have more customers who want to use this functionality, there's a huge chance that we're going to be building this out more, not only just enhancing features of tag management itself within the system, but also knowing more best practices for what to do with regards to using these APIs and cool things that we can showcase and all that sort of stuff. So you guys are kind of on the bleeding edge for this sort of stuff. I'm excited that I had the opportunity to really show it off to all of you today, and I hope that you guys can take advantage of the test stuff that we're going to be giving you guys access to. And if you have other questions, you've always got an open here at the company. If you want to work with stuff, that's why we've got the OCN. That's why we've got really helpful developers. That's why we've got our amazing support staff. That's why you've got people in the training team like me and Brianna and all that sort of stuff. We've got a ton of resources, and if we don't know the solution yet, we'd love to work with you to figure out the best way to do it. So with that in mind, just one little quick thing here. We've got next month's Training Tuesday. We already know the answer to that. It's going to be on August 30th at 11 a.m. Pacific, as per the usual. And we're going to be talking about gadgets, hopefully highlighting some perhaps gadgets that may be overlooked or underutilized, and pointing out some neat tips and tricks using those. I will be out of town, so it will be probably, I think, Brianna, our customer training manager, leading that Training Tuesday. So get excited for that. Stay tuned. The OCN will, of course, give you your registration email within the next couple weeks, and you can always read more about this on the support sites. So with that in mind, thank you guys for all of your great questions and all of your attention. I hope this has been a great session for you. It was great for me, and we'll talk to you guys next month. Almost said next year.